really my delight to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. Our presenter is Dr. Brian Czech. He's the founding president of an organization called the Center for the Advancement of a Steady State Economy. And we know him because he has been a keynote speaker at an IRAS conference in the past. He's done a lot of work with different organizations. He's served as a conservation biologist. He was the first conservation biologist in the history of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He currently serves and was concurrently serving as a visiting professor of natural resources at Virginia Tech's National Capital Region. He has written several books, Supply Stock, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and many other things. We're really delighted to welcome him. He's going to speak today, Beyond the Ideological Echo Chamber, a call for economic sanity in our time. Please, Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks, Maynard. And it's great to be here with IRAS folks, some of whom I think I would have been with. That wasn't on Star Island. That was on Lake George way back in 2012. So nice to be with you again. And I am going to pull up my slides now and share the screen. Yes, the title of the event, you might say, is Beyond the Ideological Echo Chamber. But if you don't mind, I would like to actually take it down pretty quickly from that 40,000 foot level, maybe to about a 5,000 foot level, and talk about what was originally, I think, discussed for having me this evening, which is on developing the Steady State Economy Act. And I was thinking about the hook to IRAS and sometimes religious content, theological. There's not going to be too much there. It is a science-based project we're working on here, you might say. There is a bit of a religious hook, though, in the sense that sometimes I feel like we're working on a wing and a prayer. So but why are we doing this? Why a Steady State Economy Act and not some other legislation? Well, it's our focus here at CASSE because economic growth is causing way more problems than it solves at this point in history. And we're talking about big existential type problems. And American economic policy is just outdated, especially macroeconomic, fiscal, and monetary policy. And we do have more interest among people and organizations in this 21st century about sustainability. And as we like to say at CASSE, sustainability is a steady state economy. And that's because we know that neither growth, perpetual growth, nor degrowth are sustainable in the long run. Growth is going to exceed its ecological capacity, and degrowth, that's a pretty dismal scenario pretty quickly. So that leaves one alternative, and that is that stabilized size of economy, the steady state, the sustainable option. And in particular, steady state economy, the easiest way to think of the steady state economy is as a stabilized level of production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. So we're not saying that this year's economy is a replica of last year's economy. The types of goods and services can change quite a bit over time with new technology and consumer preferences, but that level of production and consumption in the aggregate is stabilized. And that level is typically expressed in terms of gross domestic product, and stabilizing that entails a stabilized population and per capita production and consumption. And at CASSE, we wear that on our logo, and we hope that people remember it. It's a great logo, and it says a lot. If you're familiar with things like the Half Earth initiative that E.O. Wilson started, or Nature Needs Half, I don't think there's a better logo out there to represent those. And just conservation in general, a balance, an ecologically economic balance between using Earth for human economic activity and conserving Earth for natural capital, ecosystem services, and the economy of nature and its non-human species. So to get to the steady state economy, we feel it's kind of a two-track approach, public and private sector involvement, and that kind of redounds to public policy and consumer behavior, especially, and or its production and consumption, supply and demand. And these private and public sectors converge, and we hope to help them converge with a policy, with sound macroeconomic policy. And some people might say, oh, wait a minute, aren't you guys kind of jumping the gun? I mean, who do we really have right now on Capitol Hill that's going to be sponsoring a steady state economy act? Well, you know, I think that that's the wrong question. We should be developing policy in advance so that when there are politicians ready, and not just politicians, but interest groups, and perhaps IRAS and scientific professional societies and the big NGOs and so on, when they're ready, we'll be ready for them. And then there's also the sort of the concept of build it and they will come. When we can show what the contents of a steady state economy act are, presumably that will help us to communicate the vision we have for establishing that steady state and how it can be done, how it can be conduced with legislation. And besides that, you know, politics are known to change pretty quickly at times. A few examples here, like the New Deal and Earth Day and the Great Recession, much more recently. You know, and so there's sort of a chicken and egg relationship between politics and policy. We feel that there's plenty of crowing about, there's plenty of complaining about how we're bumping up against limits to growth and exceeding ecological footprint and having suffering from global heating more by the day, it seems like, and observing a biodiversity collapse and so on. Plenty of crowing about that, not many eggs yet laid. So that's what we want to try to get going, is some positive feedback there. Oh, and I mentioned that we do have these over 16,000 signatories. This is mostly just to remind me, to remind you later on that there will be this barcode and you will be able to sign the CASSE position yourself at the end of the talk. I'd like to just leave that barcode up for, you know, a minute or so. All right, so public policy, as you know, it's conducted at levels from local all the way to international. At CASSE, we have decided to focus our policy program at county and federal levels. And so we're working, you know, primarily toward the county courthouses and Capitol Hill. And so I'm just going to mention a quick aside about our county level work, and then I'll spend the rest of the time talking about the Steady State Economy Act. So at the county level, we have what we call the Keep Our Counties Great campaign. And we always emphasize in writing and enunciation, it's keep them great. We're not trying to make something great again. We've had 3,000 some countries, or I'm sorry, counties in the spectacular country that were awesome, that were beautiful, that were productive and scenic and so on. And people are complaining a lot these days that something's gone. They want to make it great. Well, if you look out the window, what's happening is in these beautiful counties, they're being beat up by the bulldozer of GDP. Now they're getting crowded, they're getting noisy, there's traffic congestion, there's red lights all over, there's crime, etc. And there's not enough green space left to mitigate for those problems, So thus, to keep our county's great campaign, and that's led by Dave Rollo, who's concurrently on the city council in Bloomington, Indiana. So he's got a lot of insight to lead this effort. We have involvement from some of our CASSE chapters as well. And the policy instrument that we're concerned primarily with at that county level is the comprehensive plan, because that's an instrument that can make a real significant difference about whether growth is going to continue or speed up in that county or not. All right, but now let's get to the policy of the day here, the Steady State Economy Act, federal legislation. You know, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I started writing Supply Shock around 2002 and didn't complete it. It wasn't published until 2013, but it was proposed in there as the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. And because it is intended to be, with the new name, Steady State Economy Act, a wholesale amendment of the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978, FEBGA, which is still the central macroeconomic policy of the United States, to the degree that the U.S. has a central economic policy. FEBGA is it. And when I wrote Supply Shock, I didn't want to just crow about or complain about or lament the demise of the country as a function of overgrowth of GDP. I wanted to propose solutions. And so the overarching one, in terms of public policy, at least, was what we're calling now the Steady State Economy Act. Right, so I mentioned FEBGA. That itself was a major amendment of the original Employment Act of 1946. And you might say it was sort of a fruition of Keynesian thought in academia and in government. And it brought not only the usual suspects in Congress, but the monetary authority as well, the Federal Reserve, Department of Treasury, into the growth game explicitly. So now we had a government fully about economic growth. So that's old stuff now. I mean, we're a lot further now from FEBGA than FEBGA was from that original 1946 Act. And then combine that with the realization that the negative effects of growth have increased exponentially. Man, we need something new for the 21st century that recognizes limits to growth, that establishes a sort of steady statesmanship, both in domestic and international affairs. Now, this Steady State Economy Act, it's a kind of a classic omnibus bill. It's paradigm shifting. It's going to incorporate new definitions in the U.S. Code. It's an organic act. It's creating some new federal entities, not a lot. I mean, that's part of the deal here, is not to have an explosion of federal government, because what the metaphor we like to use is what's good for the public goose is what's good for the private gander. We need a stabilization of the economy, both public and private sectors. It certainly has to be loaded with enough steady state fiscal policy and monetary policy, and it cannot ignore population. There's got to be population policy. There will be elements of cap and trade, especially the cap. The cap. This is a bill that's really focused on scale, the scale issue, and then less so on distribution of wealth, and efficiency of the allocation of the factors of production. There's no other legislation out there that's focused on sustainable scale. But this is, and that's one of the reasons why it will end up being classified as largely a prohibitive policy, kind of like the Endangered Species Act. It just says it puts up stop signs rather than depending entirely on taxation and market incentives and so on. It says stop this and that. And we will talk about a few of these things. So these are the real general sorts of topics. And here, then you see them reflected in the draft table of contents of the Steady State Economy Act. It's got a typical structure. We're using, one of the main formats for draft legislation. And I would say that, a bill like this, the findings and declarations of Congress are particularly important. So I want to spend a few minutes on them. We're not going to go through all of the findings, but let's take a few of them. Congress finds that economic growth, as measured with GDP, requires a growing human population, increasing per capita consumption, or both. Congress finds that consistent with the natural sciences, including basic principles of physics and biology, there are limits to economic growth within and among nations. This is already at this stage, Section 2A2 is a significant paradigm shift away from FEBGA. And Congress finds then that there is a fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, including the maintenance of clean air and water, productive soils, biodiversity, etc. And so then some of the other findings pertain not just to the environment, but to the implications for the economy and society. Oh, and by the way, these findings very much mirror the CASSE position on economic growth. And that means that Congress will have, once again, that sort of that built-in constituency of the tens of thousands of signatories. We've got about 300 organizations that have endorsed the CASSE position. And hopefully by the time we want to get this rolling on Capitol Hill circa 2030, there will be a lot more of these. These findings of Congress are based on sound science and common sense. They sort of they bring some common sense back to Capitol Hill to refute the old win-win rhetoric that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. Excuse me. Okay, and it sets a clear stage, this collection of findings of Congress for the declarations of Congress. These I would like to read. There's only a handful of them. But at this stage, Congress is ready to declare that it is hereby the policy of the nation to undertake a gradual but certain transition from the goal and pursuit of economic growth to the goal and pursuit of a sustainable, steady state economy with stabilized, mildly fluctuating population and per capita consumption, as indicated by GDP. Secondly, Congress declares that the transition to a steady state economy must be undertaken with every intent and effort to achieve and maintain the full employment of the labor force, consistent with environmental protection and other aspects of economic sustainability, including a balanced federal budget and the effective control of inflation. Third, the President, Cabinet, Council of Economic Advisors, the Fed, and federal agency directors will immediately cease and desist from developing strategies and initiatives to grow or stimulate the economy. Existing policies, programs, and projects designed explicitly to grow or stimulate the economy shall not be extended beyond fiscal year 2030 or beyond the designated sunset date, whichever comes first. Fourth, the Congressional Research Service, collaborating with the Office of Management and Budget and the advisors, will review and summarize the federal agency mission statements, goals, objectives, policies, programs, and practices designed for growth, and produce a report on federal growth incentives no later than April 30, 2030. By the way, we have provided a great head start to the CRS in this matter, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, actually, there's two more declarations. This one in which Congress declares that a commission on economic sustainability. So here's a bit of organic acting legislation. A commission on economic sustainability is established to include, catch this, the administrator of the EPA and the secretaries of Ag, Energy, and Commerce, chaired by the Secretary of the Interior, to estimate and monitor environmentally sustainable levels of population and socially optimal levels of GDP. This commission will produce a report on sustainable population and optimal GDP no later than August 2031. And finally, that commission chair with the council of, and there's some entities listed here, and drawing on that report on federal growth incentives and the council's report on sustainable population and optimal GDP, will develop and deliver to the president 2032 a 25-year steady state transition plan detailing and scheduling the adjustments, modifications, additions, and deletions necessary to establish a system of government operations most conducive to a steady state economy. So, you know, there's no way Congress can declare we hereby establish a steady, but the declaration can be made that the transition plan will be published to establish a system of government operations that's conducive, that two-track path to the steady state economy, the public sector part of the job. And based upon the report published by the commission at some estimated optimal level of GDP. Oh, there was one more. President, cabinet secretaries, and agency directors shall not overlook the existence, neglect the enforcement, or underfund the performance of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, NEPA, or any other of the nation's environmental laws or regulations on grounds that said laws or regs may interfere with the workings of the economy or slow the rate of GDP growth. So by the end of section 2, findings and declarations, that paradigm shift has been completely expressed. Now, where are we with the contents of the steady state economy, which, by the way, we envision as being roughly 100 pages. You know, we're not, we're a small nonprofit. So far, we're the only ones working on this. And so we've got to be reasonable about, and furthermore, given that it is such a paradigm shifting bill, we're not going to find the appetite out there to digest the 500-page balanced budget act like Kasich tried to get Congress to stomach back in 1998. But we have completed a number of the sections already, and other sections we have partially completed, and others we have yet to really touch. So the process of this is a process of developing what we call feeder bills. And this is so that we can build congressional support one issue at a time. And by the way, if any of you out there are familiar with lobbying Congress or trying to get legislation passed, a more normal process, the more typical process is not to actually draft the legislation yourself, but to bring to your representative or senator, committee, a policy brief that describes a problem and how you want it solved or what would solve this. And then they, if they buy into it, one of their staffers, one of their attorneys will develop the legislation. Well, here, we're not going to find that buy-in just yet. And furthermore, I don't know that there's a staff attorney on the Hill that's got a hill of beans worth of ecological macroeconomics in their conceptual toolkit. So we're just drafting the legislation ourselves, and we'll have policy briefs to accompany that. And we already do in a sense. I'll show you that. And it's a good way to start identifying some of the sponsors of the big broad bill at some point. And meanwhile, we can get bits and pieces of some meaningful policy reform rolling, we think. So here are some of the feeder bills. Okay, I'll admit, actually, these are most of the feeder bills that we've completed so far. We've completed the Commission on Economic Sustainability Act. That's pursuant to that declaration. What was it? Declaration number 4 or 5, the establishment of the Commission on Economic Sustainability, chaired by the Secretary of the Interior. We've developed a Sustainable Missions Act that replaces those pro-growth mission statements in a number of federal agencies with steady state mission statements. This was the one we published just last week. This is one of mine, the Sustainable Budgets Act. So you might call it a half of our fiscal policy requirements come out in the Sustainable Budgets Act. A Luxury Cap Act, it's one of our earlier ones. It's fairly simple. Salary Cap Act and a Mileage Fee Act. And you see people that might be affected by all three of these acts right here. So with these feeder bills, they correspond with sections or subsections, of course, in the Steady State Economy Act. And at the end of the day, we need to be rolling these back up into the full omnibus bill. This slide, I can't remember exactly. Oh yeah, I think the purpose of this was to point out that some of these sections that we have completed or are almost completely done with, sort of feed into other sections. Like each of these sections will have their own definitions. There will be some redundancy, what we might call productive redundancy, as we develop these feeder bills. But of course, when we roll them up into the full omnibus bill, then we have the job of consolidation among definitions and prohibitions and penalties and enforcement. Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples, and then we'll be most of the way through this. First example is the Sustainable Budgets Act. This is a feeder bill that came out last week in the Steady State Herald. That's our weekly blog. And it is as it sounds. You notice it's budgets plural. So we're not talking about the 2025 budget. It's an act to establish the principles of sustainable budgeting. So just like the Steady State Economy Act has those findings and declarations of Congress, this SBA has findings and declarations that really reflect the broader SSEA findings and declarations. And, we find that there's plenty of political viability, at least for balanced budgets at this point, right? I mean, there have been caucuses calling for a balanced budget for decades now, and they've got closer and closer. And our approach to this would be the same approach relative to that of the crazy Doge. Oh, boy, like I say, I'm glad I quit the federal government about 5 years ago. And our Sustainable Budgets Act dovetails explicitly in the language with the goal of establishing a steady state economy, because we, are planning for the day when it's rolled up into the Steady State Economy Act. And yes, we do prescribe widespread cuts. The thing is, we also prescribe the protection of what we call sustaining departments, agencies, and programs. These are 33 departments, agencies, and programs that are all about conservation of natural capital and protection of the environment. And it spells it out in the act, in the findings and declarations, that we must do this because that is ultimately the foundation of the economy. We're not doing it to hug the trees and to save the fish. We're doing it. I mean, a lot of us will appreciate those activities as well, but we're doing it to protect the economy. It's the economy, stupid. You better protect the natural capital, the ecosystem services, the soils, the waters, the fisheries, the minerals, and so on, if you want your kids and grandkids to have an economy. So we protect 33 sustaining agencies. We've got more agencies identified that just ought to be cut. Most of them are 20th century or 19th century, practically pro-growth kinds of outfits. Okay, and for each feeder bill that we produce, there's two main products. We have, of course, the bill itself. Here's kind of the first page of the Sustainable Budgets Act. You can easily find these online. If you go to the Steady State Herald right now, you will find that the top article is this one, introducing the Sustainable Budgets Act. This week, our quarterly newsletter comes out. So this will still be the top article for one more week. And then next week, we're going to be introducing the Sustainable Taxes Act. And we put in parentheses steady state style. We're definitely not doing it like this. We're taking a nice ecologically economic scalpel to government spending, not a crazy big tech capitalist chainsaw to our hard-won federal government. So, okay, now let's go to a salary cap act, which kind of relates to some of those. This also is fairly viable these days already, capping salary. Just think, what's one of the most beloved pastimes, sports in the USA? It's football, it's the NFL, and the salary cap is what has saved the NFL and many of its legacy programs like the Green Bay Packers. Or, by the way, I was a Green Bay Packer. Yeah, I worked at the packing plant in Green Bay day after high school. But anyway, Packers, Pittsburgh Steelers, the small market teams, probably New England Patriots. These would have never survived without a salary cap. So, there's plenty of appreciation of this approach in the country, and a number of politicians supporting this concept in general. What we brought to the table is, first of all, an actual cap, not just taxation of salaries, but a cap as prohibitive policy with penalties for going beyond it. And we broke it down by the North American Industry Classification System sectors, so that we recognize that managerial personnel probably warrant somewhat of a higher cap than, say, the folks working at the fast food joint. That's how it is. It does make sense. And the other thing, you may, if this figure resonates with you or rings a bell at all, this is the president's salary. And we say, by God, in a constitutional democracy, in a century of supply shock and limits to growth, who should be making more than the person who has the greatest, should have the greatest respect, certainly should have the greatest number of votes, and so on. So that's why that cap is set as it is. And we do have some natural allies for the Salary Cap Act. We visited some staffers of Bernie Sanders. And certainly these senators would all be some of the next ones we would go talk with about it. In the House, we certainly have those who have supported high levels of taxation for corporate CEOs. Okay, so now let's talk just a little bit how this project moves along. Yeah, we draft the bills, we publish the Herald articles to kick off the bills for the public. And meanwhile, we are online maintaining a draft table of contents so that you can check anytime you like and see what we've done. We have linked at that table of contents to the sections that correspond with feeder bills that we have published. So these are just a handful of examples. And policy briefs, for now, we're sticking with the Herald articles as a form of policy brief, but at some point, especially if we can get a grant or some type of funding to beef this up a bit, we'll be using some of the more conventional means for circulating some of these more currently viable feeder bills. And of course, all along, we're little by little developing alliances to move along these feeder bills. And we do want to make it clear that we're not conducting lobbying per se, but we're conducting political outreach. We are a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization. That's the subsector of the 501c3 laws that we're categorized on. So it's an educational activity. People on the Hill can take it or leave it. We just tell them about, the pros and cons. Oh, here's one that's crossed off. Well, the last time I gave this talk, actually, a number of things have changed since then, but this talk was to CACOR, the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, and we had a vacancy for a policy specialist to work on the Steady State Economy Act. We ended up hiring a person to work on the act, senior economist, but I would not rule out the hiring of one more person. We have a vacancy right now for a communications specialist. But if we found a person who's savvy to drafting bills and the accompanying articles, and if you're interested in this, then let us know. So now the timeline for Steady State Economy Act. We have a goal of completing the feeder bills by the end of the year. And what that will allow us to do is spend a few months in rolling up the feeder bills and consolidating them into the omnibus bill, and then rolling out that Steady State Economy Act in April of next, so about 1 year from now. And I should mention that at CASSE, we have a good solid 3-year window of opportunity for this. I'm talking about in terms of our budget. So if there's anyone out there that thinks this is a good idea, please be aware of this. We were very fortunate to find the funding sort of up front for a 3-year window of opportunity, but that's it. That's sunsetted. The date is pretty much established when that's gone, and that's 3 years from now. So I hope that we're able to find the support to carry this beyond actually what would be 2028. This will take us about a year. That's the plan, and that'll leave us with 2 years, 2 funded years at the moment, for building more alliances, networking on Capitol Hill, introducing more of the feeder bills. And then hopefully we are able to work on that for more than just those couple more years, so that by 2030, we can have some member of Congress Probably not going to be the Speaker of the House, but somebody in Congress introduce a steady state economy act. And if not, it's still by no means some kind of failure. I mean, this kind of legislation, I think we should view it as sort of timeless. It's awaiting its political day. But time is of the essence too, for things like the planet, our climate, stabilizing biodiversity, and stabilizing our natural capital stocks, water, for God's sake, and so on. So that's the timeline we have in mind. We sure encounter some challenges, and we're going to have a morass on our hands toward the beginning of next year to deal with the overlapping material and the making sure the definitions work across the board, and making sure we have a consistent schedule of penalties and so on. Those kinds of things. There's plenty of those. Another thing we'll face is the fact that we're writing this as organic legislation, when in fact, there's going to be a lot of amending legislation that will result from the Steady State Economy Act. And so we're definitely going to need support when we get to the Hill from some member of Congress, or better yet, a committee that can devote some of the legislative attorneys to help determine how the U.S. code has to be amended pursuant to the Steady State Economy Act. And yeah, and of course, politically, we're going to be kind of hearkening back to an older age of, you might recall that prior to the Reagan Revolution, prohibitive policy was relatively common. That changed to a more market-oriented approach to public policy when Reagan was in office, especially. And so now we've got to kind of try to go back in time to a more prohibitive approach, but we feel it's feasible. It's becoming more feasible as limits to growth become more evident. And then finally, we always face the challenge of exactly when we're going to explicitly bring out what we sometimes call the 800-pound gorilla. It's, you know, I like to use this metaphor quite a bit, because when I was in the federal government and I was trying to develop a program from within the headquarters of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to raise public awareness of the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, the substance was appreciated pretty much throughout the agency, but at the political appointee levels and the aspiring chiefs among the civil service aspiring for political appointments and SES appointments, they didn't want something that upstream swimming to rock the boat for them, right? So we all started calling it being economic growth, or the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. We started calling that the 800-pound gorilla. And so similarly with these feeder bills, we don't always, in every single one of them, have to talk about limits to growth and so on. And anyone who really digs into this project, who we are and stuff, they'll find soon enough that our aim ultimately is a steady state economy. So if anyone would like to help with this, please, you can join CASSE. Obviously, you can donate, you can volunteer. Oh boy, how we would love to find an experienced legislation bill writer out there. And boy, it would be doubly lucky if we found a monetary economist who can draft that segment which I think we have place held as Section 6 in the Steady State Economy Act. We need liaisons for allies and members on the Hill. And like I say, you know, if you really want to do this a lot, may be able to pay some. And if you would like to follow our progress and think about it for a while before you actually get involved, again, I encourage you to join CASSE. It's only $25 to join CASSE. And by the way, you get one of our titles as a membership gift, one of our books. I just have to do this because I think one of your more recent talks was on one of the books that we published recently, The Age of Few Machines. Outstanding book to get you up to speed on where big tech is trying to take us. It's a scary, unsustainable, ugly place. But if you join CASSE, you know, we're not making money on that. We may even lose a little bit when you select Few Machines as your membership gift, but that's fine. We're an educational organization, so that's fine. We just want you in the loop. And also, if you don't want to join CASSE, please at least subscribe to the Steady State Herald. Just go to the Herald page and hit subscribe, and you'll just get a weekly article. And we feel that we do pretty well with those. Our slogan at the Steady State Herald is original journalism, real sustainability. Original journalism, real sustain. We don't reprint articles, and we don't talk about green growth except to critique it. All right, and not because we're against opinions, but because it's a science-based, congruent with ecological macroeconomics source or outlet. So we do, on the other hand, entertain any number of comments at the Steady State Herald. So if you were a green growther, neoclassical economist, you're totally welcome to argue to your heart's content there at that Herald. And then, and of course, you can monitor the table of contents later when this thing comes out on YouTube or whatever. You can always get this URL. And so finally, I would just like to leave this up for a moment as we transition from my talk to Mark's input and discussion, and then I can take this down in, you know, just a minute or so. Thank you so much for hearing me out on the Steady State Economy Act, and I'll look forward to a great discussion.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was really fabulous, very thought-provoking. As was just noted, we have a respondent, and the respondent is Mark Kuprich. He is a business leader in the Vermont area. He was a semiconductor engineer. He also was an engineer at IBM. He's been involved in a lot of different programs, and again, we know him because of his decades-long leadership for the IRAS summer conferences. He is going to be the respondent for this. Please, Mark, join us now, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. And I want to remind people, you can put questions in the question box.
Great. Thank you, Gail. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and put on your video too.
Oh, I thought I had it on. There it is. There we go. Hello. Thank you so much. Boy, I want to thank everyone for putting this together, and you guys make me sound so good in my titles there. It's wonderful. Brian, thank you for this. I listened with bated breath. I can't think of anything more important than knowing that some organization is trying to think about how we can get away from some of the brutal competitive aspects of capitalism, really. You know, my minister in my church right now, she talks about how we are living in the end stages of capitalism, and you see it everywhere. It's brutal. The things I noted that I was interested in hearing that you had to say was that you're looking at a steady state economy act. And the idea that you're actually looking at developing legislation or getting people to agree that legislation is the way to go to move the U.S. economy towards a steady state thing is amazing. I thought that was very, very important. It seems like it's a real work in progress, what you've got going here. Um, and it is. Most of throughout your whole talk, I kept thinking about the capitalistic aspect of the United States. We are capitalists. It's a market-driven economy. Much of what you're talking about sounds a little bit like more of a social democratic approach, where the raw profit and loss and the risk triangle that includes what is produced, what the market needs, and how much individuals earn as a result of taking the risk to produce these things. That all falls under right now the way we do capitalism. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about whether you think capitalism itself, to what extent it can be modified to make your plan work, especially as regards salary caps. That has never really worked, as far as I know. If the U.S. Hopefully is successful in introducing something that approaches a steady state economy, I'm just wondering if the U.S. is able to do that and other major economies don't. If they proceed with a more capitalist agenda, to what extent would that help the environment itself? Um, there's a parallel there with the oil industry. We know that if we suddenly stop using a lot of petroleum, what's to stop other nations from continuing to extract it and use it? So there's a similarity there. I see. I liked your idea of the feeder bills, actually beginning to think about specific bills that you could begin to attract legislators with, to get them working on. I thought that was a great idea. I'm wondering if you actually have specific, you mentioned looked like 5 or 6 legislators there. Do you have any people from the GOP? Are they interested in any of this? And I think that's about enough there. I guess the last thing I would say is on the taxation system, how Americans are taxed, and we know it's not fair right now. That's the money that pays for everything that moves the economy forward. And unless you can get hooks into how Americans are taxed for whatever work they do fairly, we're still going to have extremely rich people who are, sequestering a lot of wealth that could be used towards the programs that we need for, for the wealth of the nation. So thank you very much, and I'll let that go now and turn that back to you.
Thanks so much, Mark, for your comments. I mean, Brian, do you want to address the questions that Mark raised first?
Well, yeah, there were a number of them, and so I don't want to, monopolize the discussion time, but maybe I could take one or two, maybe consolidate the part about the couple of questions about capitalism. If you are a student of ecological economics, the dailiest tradition in ecological economics, most notably, you'll know that we distinguish a lot among different types of goods and services. And the kinds that are readily rival and excludable goods and are really fine to be allocated in the market that's relatively free. It's a very efficient, much more efficient way to go about the allocation of those resources, the resources that go into those goods, than it is to try to centrally plan that, like was failed so miserably at by the Soviet Union, for example. But on the other hand, first of all, we're in no kind of laissez-faire economy to start with. I mean, starting in the year 2025, we have very much a mixed economy for many decades now. You know, we've got Social Security, for God's sake. We have national forests, national parks, a number of national things. And so we have public goods that we have recognized as a polity that cannot be allocated in a free market. And another thing about the concept of a free market and how that's supposed to fit with a so-called capitalist system is that then we wouldn't have so many incentives like a FEBGA to make economic growth more likely than it would with an actually free market. So we feel like there is nothing in the US Constitution that precludes the establishment of a steady state economy with certain sorts of caps and certain prohibitive policies. It's just like law in general and society. Society is free to do, citizens are free to do the things that they like within the law. And so we just need the right laws for the times. And we feel like we need laws to protect people coming in the coming generations, as well as the environment. Any GOP politicians? Well, yeah, those 16,000 signatories, those aren't necessarily partisan in any sense. We have people that look out the window and they see more and more crowding, more and more noise, and more competition among nations, more and more threats to national security as a function of a growing GDP, if they really think about it. And so they sign the CASSE position. And yeah, some of them are more aligned with certain feeder bills than others. But well, okay, I really appreciated all that attention to detail, Mark, and I'll look forward to probably us building on some of those points during the course of the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Brian and Mark. Let me now turn to the questions that are in the Q&A box. First question: are the declarations applicable today under the current Trump rampage?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, once again, we're pushing the envelope politically. We feel that these findings and declarations are absolutely applicable today. Whether or not the Trump phenomenon makes them more or less applicable, or more, I don't think applicable, it's more like politically viable, maybe is what they're getting at. And at the moment, no, but I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that Trump haplessly is going to actually wind up helping us to educate the public on the stupidity of pulling out all the stops for GDP growth at this point in history. And or he will be helping us to educate the public on the wisdom of conserving our natural capital, protecting our civil servants that work for the protection of our natural resources, and that as DOGE does its meat axe chopping up of the government, maybe we should be thinking about being a little more selective and letting the elements in the federal government that take away from the free market and provide all these subsidies and tax breaks and so on to corporations. Let's get rid of those programs and really protect our capital, starting with our natural capital. Oh, you're muted, Gail.
Thanks for telling me, Brian. I was trying to reduce background. I've done futures studies for years where there seem to be two groups. Those focusing on environment like you that lead to steady state economics versus those focusing on tech like now AI, which tends to focus on economic growth. So how does AID interact with steady state? And how does a guaranteed income relate if not enough jobs are available for everyone?
Was the question, how does AI relate to artificial intelligence?
It says AID. I think it might mean AI, but maybe you know what AID is.
Maybe artificial intelligence developed, because in the context of the,
I think it's probably means AI development. I think that's exactly right.
okay. Well, we're very critical of, to start with, the concept of green growth. See, green growth is the concept of green growth is based on the idea that we can develop technology to meet and solve every environmental problem that ever arises, and therefore continue to grow the economy perpetually. The thing that gets overlooked all the time in discussions of technological progress is, where does it come from? It's not manna from heaven. Technological progress is has a heavy ecological footprint at this stage. You think about the data centers, the resource requirements of these data centers. That's an example. But if you want to conduct research and development, it takes money. And money itself is generated at the trophic base. We call it the trophic base using principles of ecology. The trophic base of the economy, where agricultural and extractive surplus occurs. That's what allows to, that's what frees the hands for the division of labor into all those other activities, including the research and development activity. So it kind of backfires if it's a negative sum game to think that you're going to solve environmental problems by throwing ever more R&D money at it, because you had to liquidate ever more stocks of natural capital in order to throw ever more money at the research labs. And then probably at Gale, as you probably know, our R&D system is not designed by any means. It's not oriented toward conserving natural capital. It tends to be oriented toward extractive and production systems and increasing profits. The bulk of R&D is corporately funded, and the government funded R&D. A lot of that comes from corporate taxes, and so politically, a lot of the government R&D is also oriented toward, economic growth, if you could summarize it as. It's been a while since we studied the ratios on that, but I do recall that the amount of R&D that's initially intended to result in more conservation is minuscule. It's like 1% or much less of the R&D budget out there.
Great. Next question. How do we reduce the national debt? The Biden administration increased it, and the Trump administration appears to be increasing the US debt.
Well, that one, thanks for a straightforward one, because that one, you can't get much more straightforward than that. Gotta balance the budget. That's kind of that should be kind of a no-brainer. The problem is that heretofore, it has been the assumption of politicians and economic advisors in the government that, all right, if we have a deficit this year, we don't have to panic, because we're going to have a growing economy next year, the year after. So we will be able to pay back what was added to the debt. We'd be able to pay that interest and even start paying back some of that principal as long as we have enough economic growth. And oh boy, then you fall into a trap pretty quickly, because you're the Keynesians in government, especially, but a lot of just, politicians in government as well. They're going to say, hey, you give the money to me, put it in my district, and I'll help you grow that economy. So you will have more tax revenue, pay off this deficit and the interest on that debt. It's the wrong approach in the century of limits to growth, in the century of supply shock. So we have to have a Congress that finds, like we do in Section 2 of the steady state Congress that gets it about limits to growth. And it doesn't seem very likely in this Congress, given the fact that there's not a single one of them that's an ecologist. There's hardly any single biologist, or a couple of members of Congress that have some biology background by virtue of the fact that they're physicians or whatever, but that's minuscule levels of ecological understanding. So that puts the onus, I think, on organizations, individual activists and organizations, if they're trying to set their priorities about what kind of activism to participate in. Well, I really urge them to emphasize limits to growth and the scale issue, as we call it in ecological economics, because nobody else is doing. There's very, very few of us doing that. And as far as I know, Mark alluded to this earlier, or I think kind of guessed that correctly, that we're the only outfit working on steady state legislation, unless somebody out there is doing it in the dark.
Great, thank you. Another question, given that scientists are calling for great urgency, for example, half the greenhouse gases by 2035, do we have the time to make these changes, especially given the current political environment?
Well, I mean, what do you say to a question? You got to do what you can do. When I was a kid and my brother, we talk about, okay, what are you going to attempt to do? I don't know if it was in sports or school or whatever, but kind of his motto for a while was, what's the use of not trying? If there's a huge problem out there, either try to work towards solving it or you don't. And at the end of the day, I feel that as I wrote about in my first book, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, I think we are on a runaway train. I think we're headed towards some kind of serious economic and ecological meta crisis. But a runaway train can be going 1,000 miles an hour when it hits, or 800 miles an hour, right? So I feel that the speed of that runaway train, the speed of that economic growth, matters a great deal in how many casualties, human and non-human, there are at the time of meta crisis.
Great. Another question, is the focus on counties and the federal government sufficient? Sustainability issues do not know national boundaries. Is there a level of analysis issue here?
Well, yes. And I think, as you, Gail, mentioned in the intro, we have worked at international levels. We do when we're called to, if the time is right and so on. But with the funding that we have, this 3-year window of opportunity, we being Americans working for a 501c3 here, we have decided strategically that the county level with the comprehensive, actually, let me explain that a little bit more. It's not only the fact that at a county you have a comprehensive plan, it's the fact that you still at a national level, like if you read the Washington Post, New York Times, etc., almost never are you going to find controversy about economic growth. I mean, in the sense of any serious critique by any high-level politician about the process of economic growth. But you find it all the time in local newspapers, in particular where they're writing about the county commission, inviting or keeping at bay the bulldozers. So that's one of the reasons we decided to focus at county as well as federal levels. And then also we thought that in some of the more rural counties, especially, not only would we have a natural proclivity to connect with them because they have greatness remaining and they want to keep it that way, but a lot of times there's less bureaucracy to have to deal with for a small nonprofit like ours. If I look around where I am right now, Arlington, Virginia, for God's sake, the Arlington County government is bigger than probably some of the governments around the world, country governments around the planet. So we would need a much bigger nonprofit to have any sort of sway in Arlington County. But I think that we can find allies in counties that need help with the development of a required comprehensive plan. But really, the ultimate answer to that question of theirs, Gail, is that we're a small nonprofit. We can't do everything. We'd love to have a policy program big enough to be taking on, we would like to amend, for example, the SSEA convention, which establishes something that is similar to what NEPA does in the United States. It requires the parties to that convention to assess the impacts, the environmental impacts of what they're going to be doing. And what we wanted to get in there, this is why we participated in what we called the Kyiv Communique, where we met with a consortium in Ukraine to hammer out a statement pushing back against the Nord 2 pipeline, not just by virtue of the fact that the pipeline is an environmental hazard, but no, rather by virtue of the fact that all that fuel coming in from Siberia or whatever is going to be fueling this GDP that is a massive environmental problem. So yeah, we get involved in international activities when it's basically when it's funded and when we have the people power.
Great. So there are several more questions, Mark, but I'm going to make this the last one, and it's a short one. What are the population related initiatives?
Well, that may sound like a short question.
Mm-hmm.
I'll only mention then what kind of distinguishes CASSE on this front, because some of the other things like, reducing child tax credits and stuff, that's kind of obvious. And that'll be in the Steady State Economy Act too. And family planning incentives, we need to keep the educational elements, especially rolling on those. But the thing that really distinguishes us, I think, is our position on immigration, which will be, I believe, in Section 7 of the Steady State Economy Act. So we say that the borders should be tightened. But, and there's a big but there, but only concurrently with the United States announcing to the world that we are getting off the growth path and transitioning to a steady state economy. Because a steady state economy entails that stabilized population times per capita consumption. And you can't do that in the US at this point in history, given demographic trends, without tightening borders. However, if you tighten them like Trump does and are hell bent on GDP growth and drill baby drill and tearing up the terms of trade for all the other countries in the world, well, what kind of friends is that going to make for us? That's not even decent for national security, for God's sake. So we feel that there is the rationale to temper rates of immigration. And then what we also have in that bill that we're working on is an aid in place fund. So that instead of having to spend all the money on the services for immigrants and so on, we are spending the money to help in regions whereby there's conditions have deteriorated so much where they feel the pressure, the need to emigrate. That's it in a nutshell.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. Thank you, Mark.